again, it's still me, but don't worry. I have a lot of precious guests coming and to join me and to talk about the consumer experience of identity. So, with no further ado, let's call in Barbara Langer from Inside Angels and Michael Becker from Assurant. Hello to both of you.
Hi there.
And Barbara and Michael, a quick introduction to both of your career. It would take longer as well, but Barbara, a research specialist that goes back to eBay, T-Mobile, and many others, and now a co-founder of its own Inside Angels company. Now, Barbara and Michael have been instrumental. Michael, you might have seen him in so many of our events as well, a well-known figure in the identity and personal data management discussions, himself working for strategy with Assurance, one of the largest insurance company in the US, as well as different role in the past, and looking at the questions from both an academic and a real business side. We're very happy to have both Barbara and Michael as our authors for the second year running for the Consumer Trust Study. And Michael actually has got a longer history with our 7 year of analysis of the market. So welcome to both of you. And today, just to make sure that I am fully challenged, I believe that we also having some questions for our interactive questions, the poll to our viewers out there. Oh yes, go to the poll, I see that, and vote. I'm not going to tell you too much. You will see that in the poll there are 2 questions for you eventually, and trying to guess what people out there have thought about their reactions, their interactions with security, privacy, and identity and data. Now, without, I'm just taking some more time, so I don't give too much out there. Go to the polling, choose, and I'm not saying, I don't let, yes, there it is. I see already some of you are putting in the polling questions some of the answers. So I'm not trying to influence them, because Barbara and Michael, if I let you speak, you might say something that will tell us next. Now, one questions to everybody out there: go on the website of Mobile Ecosystem Forum and download the full report. We have a pleasure of having Michael and Barbara here for 40 odd minutes, 50 minutes, but actually that the report is really fully packed of information and very good stuff. So download that. But today we're talking about one of the elements, which is one of the discovery in the research itself, which is how to segment the reactions of a consumer trust study. So maybe, Barbara, you can tell us more, and Michael will come and ask for your comments in between.
Lovely. Yeah. So, shall we get going? I'm not sure. Can everybody see the?
It's
there
coming.
we are.
There
lovely, lovely, fantastic. Well, thanks for that lovely introduction, Dario. Hopefully, I'll be able to move through the slides. So, really, the content for today's session comes from MEF's 7th annual trust study, as Dario mentioned. It's quite a major study, really. It covers all facets of trust, data privacy, data security. It collates insights from 6,500 smartphone users across 10 markets. It's fairly substantial, and it's fairly recent. The fieldwork was conducted just earlier this year. So what I'm going to do is quickly recap the big highlights from this study, which were covered also in a recent briefing session, but definitely also encourage you to download the full report. But then we're going to go into more depth on one of the really important outcomes of the study, which is our segmentation of smartphone users. And hopefully we'll demonstrate the need to just really think about who we're targeting and meeting them where they're at, both rationally and emotionally. So just diving straight into this recap of those broader study learnings. First big insight that came out was that we saw a huge chasm between user expectations and industry performance, or perceived industry performance, when it comes to privacy and security. There's just a huge gap in terms of where people are at and how well they think the industry is delivering. Their needs are not being met today. However, secondly, somewhat reassuringly, we did start to sense that there was some improvement in the environment, because a significant minority, something like 40% or so, were starting to feel like the privacy situation and security from threats were kind of going in the right direction for them. Still lots of scope for improvement, but that was an interesting finding. Thirdly, we also saw that the trend for taking protective action has continued. We've seen this year over year for a few years now. And this year, 84% of smartphone users globally had taken at least one action to protect their data. So it may not be that their actions are comprehensive and fail-safe, but they've taken at least one action. And the most common were changing privacy settings and managing cookies. So people definitely understanding the need to do something, the need to act. But as per the fourth point here, taking action didn't necessarily correspond to them feeling more confident about being protected. And this is a really important theme that we explore a lot through the segmentations that we've done. And I'll come on to discuss that more. So when it comes to tools to protect your data and barriers to using them, what people do complain about is cost and complexity. So they feel it's a bit of a burden to just figure out what they need to do, how to navigate their options between what's out there. And there's also a bit of a lack of willingness to invest more money and effort than they're doing already, because they haven't all necessarily felt the benefit, felt completely reassured from the actions they've already taken. There's a bit of a broken link. Finally, we also explored how user confidence could be improved. How could we increase that? And what people tell us is that what it really comes down to is full transparency and full control over how their data is used. So, for example, people want to instantly know what data about them is held, and they want to feel like they own the rights to that data and therefore have the ability to change it, to remove it from others' possession as they please. So these are all the big headlines from the overall study. But what we're going to focus on today for the rest of this short presentation is the different segments that exist in the market when it comes to managing personal data. So we'll look a bit about into how they differ and the actions that companies might need to take to address each of them. And we just think that this provides quite a helpful lens through which to understand the market and start breaking it down into addressable chunks. So we've identified 6 segments based on respondents self-identifying with one of 6 statements. And then we've then profiled each of the segments through a number of other data points that we collect in the study, such as demographics, behaviour and attitude. And the segments range from the unaware, on the top left here, this is the smallest segment, who do not see a need to protect their data, right through to the empowered on the bottom right, who do take quite a few actions and feel that their risks when sharing data are largely mitigated to a reasonable extent through the actions they've taken. What we've actually found is that the majority of users fall into segments in between those two ends of the spectrum. So it's not quite linear in that way, but most users are taking action, but not seeing a reassuring enough benefit. So in a moment, we're going to learn a bit more about the segments one by one. I'll introduce you to each of the segments. But first of all, I thought it would be useful to just size them for you. So here we have a comparison of segment sizes by market, and I'll focus for the purposes of today mainly on the global picture, which is the left-hand stack bar in the graph here, which is just representing all the 10 markets combined. But the first general observation is that we do have a really good mix of segments. There isn't one really dominant segment that's accounting for 90% of users. There's quite a good spread. And that tells us that the statements we used are doing a reasonable job of teasing apart real differences. The largest segment globally is the impaired. So that's in the middle of the bar, the sort of medium blue colour, almost 1 in 4 users, 24% there. That segment is taking quite a lot of action to protect their data, but they say they still feel at risk. That's their dominant attitude. The segment is particularly large in China at 40%. And of course, if you're focusing on one or more particular markets, then it's obviously worth zooming in on the breakdown of segments for that market. But I'm focusing just on the global view mainly for today. The smallest segment globally is the unaware, which is 8% of global users in pale blue there. And that in itself is quite interesting, the fact that it's quite small. We can deduce from that the vast majority of users are in fact aware that there are risks out there when sharing personal data. There's not necessarily a need to educate the majority of people on that quite basic fact. They may not know the extent of the risks or where they are at most risk, but most people do know that there are risks when sharing personal data. And the other thing before moving on to introduce you to the segments, I'll just draw attention to the second largest segment globally, which is the indifferent in orange here at 19% of users. So these are the folks who are taking a few actions, but probably not enough, because to them the benefit is unclear, and it's almost like they can't be bothered. They don't feel like they have much of a role to play. And if we take the unaware and indifferent together, that then becomes a sizable chunk who need a bit more persuading of the need to act. So let's look in just a bit more detail at who those segments are as people. So firstly then, looking at the unaware and the indifferent. So both segments here not seeing a clear enough benefit to taking action to protect their personal data. Just got a few facts about each of the segments to try and bring them to life a little bit. The unaware are lower income, a little more male than average, but interestingly, they also have the lowest level of mobile usage. They're not doing as many different mobile activities, using their mobile for as many different things as other segments are. So we could question whether it's worth worrying too much about them, given that small segment size as well. The indifferent segment, on the other hand, has some similarities, but it cuts across all demographics, and it's a larger segment. Like the unaware, they also have lower than average levels of mobile activity. What is interesting is that they're more likely to have experienced data harm of some kind. But it may be that they're adopting a slightly philosophical attitude towards that as part of just the mobile life, the reality of being on their phone, because also like the unaware, they're relatively unwilling to manage their own data proactively. But as both these segments are less active on their mobile than others, it's probably going to be quite challenging to engage with them. So let's talk about the next segment. So this is the helpless. 17% of global users. They say they don't take all that many actions. They say they're overwhelmed and they don't know where to start. In actual fact, a great number of them have taken action. It's above average. But the defining characteristic with them is that negative emotion that they feel about this whole area and not quite knowing where to start and what to do to protect themselves. Now, interestingly, they have above average levels of mobile activity. They are also among the most likely to say that they get valuable services in return for sharing their data. So they're drawn to using mobile services a lot. They're slightly more female, which we also know from other data points means they're highly likely to be frequent users of social media. And they're also more likely to have experienced data harm. But the key thing to address here with them is that emotional side. They are overwhelmed, they are confused, and we really need to acknowledge that and do a bit of hand-holding show them where to begin, and just adopt the right tone of voice with this segment. Okay, so next up is an interesting segment. This is the self-assured. 17% of global users. It's actually higher in India and South Africa. They're really the opposite to the helpless in many ways. These guys are bursting with confidence almost. So they say that taking steps to protect their personal data is a top priority, and that they're confident the actions they take are as comprehensive as they can be. However, if there's one segment that's fraught with contradictions, it's this one, because in actual fact, despite claiming willingness to manage their data, they're the least likely segment to have taken protective action. And we think there's some bravado going on here, partly perhaps because they're also a younger segment and they are less likely than other segments to have experienced data harm. So it may also be that they haven't really been burnt yet. The bottom line, though, is that it's quite possible they have significant gaps in their protection despite their confidence. So there's still a need for education here, while also acknowledging that they think they know what they're doing. So it's an interesting communications challenge. And finally, we have the impaired and the empowered segments. So the impaired is the single biggest segment globally, but together these two segments collectively represent about 40% of global users, and actually much higher in China. There are quite a few similarities between these two segments. They both have above average income. The empowered are slightly older as well. They have above average mobile activity. They engage in the widest variety of mobile activities. They are willing to manage their own data, and the vast majority are taking some actions to do so. They're very engaged in this whole topic. They're the most likely segments to rate dimensions around privacy and security as extremely important to them. The key difference between the two segments is just on how secure they feel based on the actions they take. So the impaired still feel very much at risk, while the empowered feel like they have done a reasonable job of mitigating their risk. And it may be partly driven by their characters and personalities as much as it is driven by what they've actually done. But in terms of the key takeout, we would say these are really critical segments to think about in marketing and product development, etc., because they're very engaged, they understand the ever-evolving risk environment, and they're very open to considering data protection services. So these segments are really key. So I'm just going to do a bit of summing up before we open to discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to see the results of the poll and where you all are. But it's very clear overall that there's no one-size-fits-all solution or marketing tone of voice, and that we have to acknowledge both the rational side of what people are doing and how they're engaged in terms of behaviour, and the more emotional side of where they're at mentally with all of this, how willing they are, how interested they are, how confident they are in this area, what's their starting point. Because we have a situation where confidence doesn't really correlate very well with actually being protected. And of course, the opportunity by segment is going to vary depending on which market you're focusing on, which type of service you might be offering. But at sort of a basic global level, we would say for the unaware segment, it's probably a shrinking segment. We would deprioritize active engagement with them, a very hard segment to engage. For the indifferent, it's going to be about demonstrating the benefit of acting, or perhaps revealing the risk of not taking sufficient action in order to try and shake them out of that indifference. For the helpless, we need to do some hand holding to show them where to begin when it comes to protecting their data. And for the self-assured, we possibly need to flatter them because they're very confident. There's an opportunity to engage them in a conversation, but also a need for education in terms of where they might be still quite exposed. But the biggest opportunity seems to be with the impaired and the empowered segments, where potentially we could be communicating more on efficacy to reveal the benefits of actions they've taken. And there's an opportunity, we would say, to provide perhaps more holistic data management tools. So those are all my kind of insight and data slides. I'd love to just open up to Dario, to Michael, to offer further comment, maybe look at those poll results and see if anyone has any questions.
Well, let me jump in. First is I have never heard Michael being so quiet. He's never there thinking hard. But meanwhile, to everybody, there is a Q&A tab. Do let us know. Michael, first is what does it mean? If you are an enterprise out there, what should you make out of this segmentation?
Well, for me, the biggest insight is, for me, the biggest insight is it's time to serve the connected individual. I mean, when I look at this and I look at all, because you mentioned kind of both my industry and academic view, and I straddle that fence, taking these insights in combination with what else I see in the marketplace, the resounding theme for me is that people are connected, people are concerned, and they want control. And at the end of the day, these people are individuals. And so we need to start treating them as such. Now, we've started to segment them out by this insight. That segmentation is a very emotionally driven. So I think the other insight we need to realize is we so often approach business and activities with this rational mindset. And what this insight really shows us is that we're not really, rational beings that are occasionally emotional. We're rather emotional beings that are occasionally rational, right? And that's what we need to be catering our marketing services to, our educational services to. The market is essentially saying, "Help me," and we're not. What we didn't necessarily show in this presentation, and you can go watch the recording that we had from a week or two ago, there is a significant gap between what people want from us in industry and what they perceive they're getting, across the board. And in this context of privacy and security, there is a 20 to 27 to 28%, 30% gap between their expectation of how well we're protecting their privacy, aka the ability for them to be able to manage the who, what, when, where, for what purpose their personal information is being used. And there is a significant gap in their sense that we're securing that data. And I think the other insight that we're coming back from this is the vast majority of the market, well over 60% of the market, they don't really feel they have a choice. They want to use these services. They have to use these services. They cannot continue and participate in society without using these services. But yet they have, in other words, they have no choice to use them. And that's why they're feeling helpless. That's why they're feeling impaired, because the tools we're giving them to be able to actually effectively to protect themselves is significant, certainly not enough. And we've actually heard that and saw that from Andrew's presentation. He was talking about all of these wonderful new authentication and identity verification and personal information management tools that are coming, but they're nowhere near there yet. And so we have to be closing those gaps as well. So that's kind of my initial thoughts. And I've got others most certainly that we can share as we have more time.
Well, I've got, so far I have no Q&A questions. There were lots of people watching, thanks to all, but very quiet. So do unleash your question for Barbara, Michael, and even for Andrew. We will pass them on. But I think one comment that I've seen, it says 8% globally for the unaware. Is it? I'm reading between the lines. Is it really that small? It was a bit of a surprise of so few to not being aware of the issues. What's your comment, Michael? And then I'll ask Barbara as well.
Yeah. So immediately, my comment on that one is they're aware, but aware of what, right? So we, on average, if 92% of people say they're aware that their data is at risk, but really to what extent and what does it mean to be aware versus unaware? I think the most important insight for us to get from this is that people still across the board, have this emotional negative sentiment when they're approaching business, and they're like, I'm doing it, but this makes me really uncomfortable. One thing we didn't necessarily pull out, and Barbara, I just was enthralled by your presentation. I've written down, I'm going to be judiciously quoting you based on some of the things that you've reported. But one of the things we didn't report in this session was this, what are we doing when we're in this emotional state, when we're not feeling comfortable? Well, we're not buying your services. We're working with somebody else. We're deleting your app. So again, businesses need to be really careful in this environment right now. And that, yes, the data is showing us that people are using the services, but if I'm not comfortable with you, I'm going somewhere else. So that's another key insight I think we need to take away from this. So the unaware statement, I think, is more telling than not in terms of the absolute need for business to take action today.
And Barbara, what do you think of unaware? I mean, it obviously changes across the different countries.
Yeah, so it varies from 4% in the UK, very tiny in the UK, actually 3% in China, up to 14% in India. So it's usually the smallest or the second smallest segment. It is small. The statement is that there's no need for me to take any action to protect my personal data, but I definitely concur with Michael in terms of the other people, the 92%. People understand there's a risk, but do they really understand the nature of the risk, and do they really understand how to properly protect themselves? We see a lot of people taking action, but are their actions really sufficient? It's a bit scattergun for some people in terms of what they're doing, and many things that they're not doing still. So it's educating people on the nature of the risks in as engaging a way as you possibly can.
Sure. Well, and I guess one other element I would think, I call it the kind of the 5 pillars to digital sovereignty, and I'm really glad that Andrew Budd introduced that concept. I think people are kind of looking for that matrix pill where I can take one pill or the other and just have it all be solved for me. It takes more. It's not just about adjusting my preferences or using that particular VPN app or having an antivirus app or, asking the government, hey, or a company, give me my data back. It's about awareness. It's about intention and behavior. It's about adopting intentionally adopting appropriate services to help you, such as, cybersecurity insurance or other types of professional, legal services. It's about enacting your digital rights. And then it's also about adopting both active and passive technology. So again, that's a fairly complex matrix of behavioral awareness, behaviors, services, and technology that we need to be ingesting into our lives that, frankly, I just don't people think are struggling with right now because we're making it too hard as industry.
Well, we try to make it harder ourselves. Until recently, we looked at the rational elements with our analysis. This year, we introduced the segmentation, which shows, as Barbara was saying, the emotional side as well.
Yes.
Now, and here it is. What people are asking, but what does it all mean? Is it changing? Interesting question. I think a provocatory questions from Lee Zucker that says, will this ever change once the default model for digital service is surveillance? Back to you too. Are we close to a change, or is it just status quo forever?
Barbara, I certainly could jump in, but go ahead.
I'll kind of let you answer this one. I think. My view is it's not going to change in the short term. There's going to be a number of steps that need to happen, but I don't see this changing much in the short term.
Completely agree. I think, but we need to define what we mean by short term. In the age of digital and in the age of connectivity, our sense of time is exponentially growing. And I'd like to use an example of that. So when, social media and such was first being introduced in society around 2007, we're like, what's that? What are we talking about? And it took about another 4 or 5 years until around 2010, 2011, when we had 50% penetration of smartphone adoption, which was one of the big triggers that really kind of drove and improved internet and 4G and those kinds of things that evolved around 2010, 2013. We started to see these existential blockers that were hampering growth for that type of channel of communication to be removed. And then at around 2018, 2019, we had billions of people around the world using these technologies, and the fundamental shifts and fundamental changes in society had occurred and were now solidified. So what I'd like to argue is and that process of transition for society took about 12 years. What I'd like to argue is all of the impediments that were in the way of that growth, smartphone adoption, internet adoption, 5G, the other infrastructural ideas, performance of the devices, etc. They're all gone. So we're going to see, well, yes, it's going to be slow growth, but what does slow mean? I believe we're going to see a dramatic shift in the next 3 to 6 years is going to be the fundamental shift, as opposed to 12. So we don't really have time to wait and sit on our laurels as C-suite executives to get this all of this taken care of and in place. We're going to see dramatic growth and change. I also think we're going to see a segmentation in the market. We're going to see those businesses that are still doing old world models and not giving us the transparency, control, and choice that we want, true transparency, control, and choice that we want, and those companies that are. Case in point, you're going to start seeing leading companies like, for example, Apple, that's coming out and putting privacy front and center into their product offering. And wherein, some would argue that Apple has made privacy a luxury good. Now, going back to Andrew's point in the earlier presentation, that's not a good thing, because of this issue of inclusion and bias. Not to say that privacy being, Apple putting it front and center of privacy of their products not a good thing. That's fantastic. But the fact that it is an expensive ecosystem to participate in, and it does create a separation in society. We've got to fix that. So I think there's some fundamental issues around that as well. And then specifically getting to Lee's question, the answer is yes, and it will change as the self-sovereign identity models evolve. So as Andrew was pointing out in his presentation, again, it was fantastic. He was talking about how this whole new emerging model of self-sovereign identity is coming online. And right now we're really established at the credentials, at the kind of standardization stage for the evolution of self-sovereign identity, and that's really well established. And with leaders with like Kalia Young, the identity woman, who's doing some really good work globally for helping us make that happen. But again, we're going to move from standards to product in market at scale within the next, say, 12 to 18 months. So the question for all of you out there is, are you as a business integrating self-sovereign identity standards and working with organizations like iProve and or DigiMe and others within the MEF community that are pulling these self-sovereign identity and personal data store models and personal control models in place into your business today, because you don't have a whole lot of time. And one other point I would say to Lee is there are emerging models. Ad blockers are still on the rise. Identity obfuscation tools like alias emails, aliased phone numbers, aliased addresses. All of these kind of aliasing tools are starting to come online in the market right now. Where hey, Mr. Business, I'm going to interact with you, but I'm going to interact with you on my terms. And guess what? You're not going to get my real identity. You're not going to get my real identifiers. I'm going to mask those. And the second I'm done with you, I'm going to shut them off. And that's what our data is showing you. When I don't trust you, I cut you off. I delete your app. Well, now I'm going to also delete my identity from your ecosphere. So there's going to be a lot that Lee is going to happen, and it's going to happen within the next 18 to say 24 months.
Well, very interesting. I think the question from Lee is correct, and I think it's a complexity of what we've seen so far in the last 7 years. Is so much is happening in the consumer reaction. Things are really changing. Even if in the surface you don't see a lot, but you say, Michael, some of the companies are changing themselves. My personal view is whether is a risk is going to happen short term, medium term. I've heard it from Michael, actually. I'm going to steal it, but I think everybody in the board should actually start putting in that risk list of the topics to be talking about is the impact of a potential change in personal data. But what happens, and we have a question here, what happens when people, how do you explain that people, fool a strange situation with many of them giving out with no problem so much personal information on social media and opening themselves to identity theft, etc. And then worry about privacy information out there. Isn't there a fundamental problem with those two things?
I mean, I would say that to varying extent, some people do have a problem with sharing their data, some more than others, but essentially there's a trade-off that they're having to make, which is actually an impossible equation to balance because they don't have full information. They're trying to balance what's the risk of doing this versus the reward. The reward is very easy to see because they want to access this specific service. The risk is very hard to fathom, hard to quantify, hard to sort of see what that is. So they do share personal data. They do access services in return for that, but it isn't always it isn't always done in a very easy, happy way. For some people, and I think what ultimately happens is that it translates this level of concern or unease translates into other behaviours later down the line. They may become more wary of the next service that comes along that looks appealing. They may start to scrutinise things a little bit more over time, and as Michael said, they will also remove apps, delete apps. It translates into other behaviors later on when they have these kinds of underlying concerns.
Yeah, no, I think that's key. And I think the other thing that we need to think about is, and there's been some wonderful research on this, and there's different lenses to look at this concept, but it's called the privacy paradox, where we will forego our short-term, our privacy and security for short-term value and convenience every time. At the end of the day, we want this convenience of the internet. We need this convenience of the internet. And as Barbara's just pointed out, we don't really have a choice. I mean, I had a really great conversation with an FTC lawyer a few years back, and she's like, if you don't agree to, the terms of service of that, say LinkedIn, for example, if you don't agree to LinkedIn's terms of service, don't join the service. Well, frankly, in our industry, if I don't have a matured, a curated LinkedIn profile, I can't get a job. So you're actually having to make you're forcing me to make some kind of commercial Sophie's choice, which is just not acceptable, especially given what Andrew's comment was about inclusion in the marketplace. We absolutely need to be doing a better job. The other thing is, to kind of reiterate what Barbara was just saying, is there's somewhat of an unfair alignment here of an asymmetry of value to risk. I get that immediate $5 coupon for sharing my location today or sharing elements of my data. But I really, as a consumer, I am not informed about AI and technology and all of the stuff that's happening in the background that will effectively hurt me 3, 4, 5 years from now. Data breach today may not mean harm today. Data breach today may mean harm 5 years from now. Right. So the asymmetry of risk and harm, I think, is a significant issue. The other issue where we ask people in the market of read the terms, read the privacy policy, or you were informed, you said yes. Yeah, but the problem is you've got banks and banks of lawyers who have written those privacy policies and those in terms of service. And I'm one person that's just trying to either have fun, do my job, take care of my family, get educated, stay healthy. There's, again, asymmetry in information and knowledge to be able to make these types of informed decisions. So I would argue that just, again, as industry, we need to do a better job and both providing more clear and transparent tools and services to be providing more aggregated services, not making me make the choice. Like I did a list the other day from an academic view of like, what are all of the things that I would need to adopt and use if I truly wanted to lock all this down and protect myself. And there's about 20 or 30 activities and another 30 or so pieces of software that I need to invite that passively and actively work with me. That's just too much. We've got to do a better job of pulling these pieces back together and provide service to our customers.
Great. Now, at the beginning of the sessions, we set up a few questions for people to see what they believe. Now we can go back and check. If you are looking on your screen, you can check on the polling sessions. So when surveyed, people asked, what do you think is the segments which is biggest globally? And people, 21.7% report I take number of action to protect my personal data, and these mitigate the risk to a reasonable extent. So, Barbara, how did they do it? Because the biggest segment is 39%. I still take a number of actions to protect myself, but still feel at risk. Now, that's 40 plus 21, 60%. They almost got it right.
So you think that most people thought it was the empowered segment that was the biggest then? by the sounds of it, the segment that says I take a number of actions and these mitigate my risk. I'm not surprised if that's the case, actually, that within this group, within the attendees here, there's more confidence in our ability to mitigate risks using the tools available. It doesn't quite reflect reality.
And actually, can I pause you right there, Barbara? I think it's an important point. Again, that is also a reflection of the gap that we see. We as industry think we're doing a better job than we are. If we go back to the gap point that you opened up with the presentation today, that consumers don't perceive that we're doing as good as we think we are, right? So essentially that response really reflects what we're seeing in the market.
That's right. It's the second smallest segment in reality.
It's still changing, I see, but overall, I can see that the polling results is when they think about themselves. And I say that the biggest segment, 37%, was still the unfulfilled. Apologies for me missing the names. But when we ask them, what do you think? Who you are, which is the second question. Here's what we got. Now, 48% of them takes action, but still thinks of themselves a risk. Okay, and then the second one, 37%, are the ones that they mitigate the risk and to a reasonable extent. So the self-aware, as you call them. So it is a divided word, at least for our audience. They seem to, half of them still think that they are doing well. Close to 37%. They're doing enough and they feel okay. And there is a 38%, slightly bigger, I have to admit, that they still think there is more they could do about protecting their data. So as you were saying, slightly different sections, but not too far, I would say, for what we've seen. And personal data as a priority, 8%. That's how I imagine. So the view of our viewers here seems to be possibly slightly more focused on the big segments out there, but missing out the variety of the segments that we have seen. As I said, more on all of these results is available to download on the reports. I would say that we're running a couple of minutes late. Apologies, but it was always interesting to talk about this. Michael and Barbara, I'm sure we'll come back to you more and more times with the report, but for the time being, I'd like to thank you. Thanks for all of the work. Thanks for the great report out there. Do download it. And if you have additional questions, do address it to us on our chats, and Q&A will involve Barbara and Michael, I'm sure. So thank you.